I'm Ben Weingarten, and this is the Weingarten Report, the show where we bring you the most critical stories and compelling arguments and analyses on the most vital issues of our time. The Weingarten Report is brought to you by AMAC. In this week's episode, how the Biden administration's domestic terror strategy paved the way for sicking the FBI on the concerned parents of America. By now, you've no doubt heard about moderate Attorney General Merrick Garland's latest strike in the Biden administration's war on Wrongthink. In a memo, Garland says that there's been a, quote, disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools. Therefore, his Department of Justice is reportedly going to create a task force, including the Criminal, National Security, and Civil Rights Divisions, the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, the FBI, and other offices to, according to a press release, quote, determine how federal enforcement tools can be used to prosecute these crimes and ways to assist state, tribal, territorial, and local law enforcement where threats of violence may not constitute federal crimes. Garland's also directing the FBI to work with each U.S. attorney to convene meetings with leaders at all levels in each federal judicial district to, quote, facilitate the discussion of strategies for addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, and will open dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting, assessment, and response. What exactly spurred this response from the FBI and the DOJ? Well, thousands, if not tens of thousands of parents or more across the country passionately made their voices heard about their opposition to the indoctrination of their kids in critical race theory, racial Marxism, and in other cases against draconian and arguably medically dubious, if not in some cases harmful, coronavirus policies. The DOJ was responding to a letter specifically from the National School Boards Association that called on not just the DOJ and FBI, but a whole slew of other national security agencies to protect school boards from supposed domestic terrorism, in the words of the letter, and hate crimes, using a number of laws up to and including the Patriot Act. How did they justify this claim of this dire threat? Well, amazingly, the letter cites a handful of unruly audiences and audience members at school board meetings. It cites all of two people, being arrested at school board meetings, essentially for resisting being kicked out of those meetings, with one individual striking one of the people who escorted him. Now, this behavior is intolerable, but this is the stuff of domestic terrorism? The kind of thing that you'd encounter between charged up parents at a Little League game? This requires the intervention of every law enforcement agency in the federal government, at least the most powerful ones? What's this really all about? Well, as viewers of the Weingarten Report know, the Biden administration has crafted a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism that gives it wide latitude to classify almost any dissenting views from the regime's ideology and agenda as a threat. And what could be more of a threat to the regime than concerned parents who don't want their kids indoctrinated in the regime's favored woke CRT ideology, or subjected to draconian coronavirus policies that the regime has used to regulate virtually every aspect of our lives, from our schools to our places of business and our livelihoods, to our ability to see our friends, go to church, how we vote, what we're allowed to say on social media, and far beyond all those things. The regime has awoken a sleeping giant, common-sense, patriotic Americans who vote and who pay the taxes that fund these schools, and the regime cannot tolerate this dissent. How specifically did the strategy for countering domestic terrorism pave the way for this lawless, disturbing, chilling assault on our First Amendment rights, one that's meant to intimidate us? Consider, for example, the fourth pillar of that strategy. It's titled Confront Long-Term Contributors to Domestic Terrorism, and it reads in part, quote, tackling the threat posed by domestic terrorism over the long term demands substantial efforts to confront the racism that feeds into aspects of that threat. We are therefore prioritizing efforts to ensure that every component of the government has a role to play in rooting out racism and advancing equity for underserved communities that have far too often been the targets of discrimination and violence. This approach must apply to our efforts to counter domestic terrorism by addressing underlying racism and bigotry. The Biden administration took this to heart when it came to CRT. On day one, it issued an executive order decrying America's systemic racism and calling for, quote, an ambitious whole-of-government equity agenda. It revoked Donald Trump's executive order barring training of federal employees in anti-American race, stereotyping, and scapegoating, ideology like critical race theory. It abolished the Trump administration's 1776 Commission, a group whose work on American education challenged CRT. So this was a tacit endorsement of CRT. But the Biden administration also overtly endorsed it when its Department of Education supported CRT via a rule that would have prioritized grants for American history and civics education programs focused on these teachings, on this propaganda. That rule was ultimately shelved amid a backlash, but it was clear the Biden administration is pro-CRT. It stands to reason that the Biden administration would see support for CRT as consistent with its equity agenda, and opposition to CRT as an impediment to it. Equity is a concept firmly rooted in the anti-racism of the likes of Ibram X. Kendi, who we've talked about before. Kendi says that, quote, anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. CRT, then, is an anti-racist idea. Opposition to it would seem, therefore, to be racist. If countering domestic terror, the greatest threat of which comes from white supremacism, requires addressing underlying racism and bigotry, and opposition to CRT is racist, then targeting CRT critics, those who are anti-CRT, becomes a national security imperative. Now, what about on the coronavirus? Well, the Biden regime, in a series of national terrorism advisory bulletins, has said that those who challenge draconian coronavirus policies may be spurred into violent action, might constitute terror threats. An August 2021 bulletin, for example, warned that, quote, anti-government/anti-authority violent extremists will remain a national threat priority for the United States. These extremists may seek to exploit the emergence of COVID-19 variants by viewing the potential reestablishment of public health restrictions across the United States as a rationale to conduct attacks. The bulletin cited, quote, continued nonspecific calls for violence on multiple online platforms associated with domestic violent extremist ideologies or conspiracy theories on alleged reinstatement and responses to anticipated restrictions relating to the increasing COVID cases. Unquote. The Biden administration, of course, supports restrictive coronavirus policies. Policies like universal masking in schools. And in fact, they vowed to take on states who don't support or who try to combat universal masking policies at schools. The very types of policies that parents are protesting at school board meetings across the country. Biden's so-called counter-terror strategy notes that domestic terrorists, quote, espouse a range of violent ideological motivations, including not just racism, but anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. Are you seeing a pattern here? Challenging school boards on the coronavirus clearly seems to be read by the Biden administration as reflecting anti-government or anti-authority sentiment, and on a sensitive subject in the eyes of the national security apparatus in the coronavirus. The NSBA letter notes that groups are, quote, spreading misinformation that school boards are working to maintain online learning by haphazardly attributing it to COVID-19. The Biden strategy calls for, quote, enhancing faith in government and addressing the extreme polarization fueled by a crisis of disinformation and misinformation, which can tear Americans apart and lead some to violence. Enhancing faith in American democracy demands accelerating work to contend with an information environment that challenges healthy democratic discourse. We will work towards finding ways to counter the influence and impact of dangerous conspiracy theories that can provide a gateway to terrorist violence. So combating these parents also seems to fall under the misinformation mandate of the counter-terror strategy. Threatening parents into silence by sicking our nation's most powerful law enforcement bodies on them for challenging CRT or coronavirus policies would seem to be perfectly consistent with the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Its reach is virtually limitless if dissent from the regime's agenda constitutes a danger to democracy. It should now be very clear the Biden administration is poised to inflict infinitely more terror on America with its war on wrongthink masquerading as domestic counterterrorism mission than loving and impassioned parents concerned about the education and health of their children in the schools they pay for.